So as always, as I do the final marketing pushes, I want to thank you guys for joining us on this live stream. We do these every Wednesday at 2 p.m., and that's -6 GMT. And usually the topics will be posted sometime earlier on our DeviantArt and our Facebook page. And today is something a little different because it's on rendering a Powerpuff Girl, but it's not so much the subject matter that I'm going to focus on. It's the fact on rendering different shapes and looking at something and looking at it not as something like a Powerpuff Girl you see a character. But when I look at this and I think of rendering it, I think of the different shapes that I have to render and how lighting plays a big deal in that too. So, still have my volume on. So yeah, I'm going to go ahead and get started in just 1 second. And the biggest thing I want to ask you guys is if you think I should be rendering the sister Blossom or Bubbles. And I'm going to put a poll somewhere soon on the actual page, but if you could start leaving that in the comments, because as always, I'm going to put the comments on the side. And whichever one wins will be the one that I draw for today. Okay, one more. And the reason I'm going to do this one is because on every Monday I do this doodle art jam with my buddies, and it's just something to keep us motivated and kind of start off the week with drawing something maybe we're not comfortable with. But this subject matter is definitely something that I feel comfortable with, and that's rendering. And I think as an artist, you kind of know what your strengths and weaknesses are. And I think rendering is something that I've always really enjoyed, and I've come accustomed to kind of knowing the route and the different steps that you should take on how to render. Okay, so now that we're all done there, let's go ahead and get this thing started. All right, so here is the one I did a Buttercup, and pretty much I'm going to break it down into the very basics first before I even get started on Blossom or Bubbles. Whichever one we end up deciding on. So let's see here. All right, so I'm going to put Buttercup on the side. I'm going to take away the sky background so we can just work simply on a gray background, because it's a lot easier to see the different values and there we go. And see the colors that you're using in complements to each other and whether or not it's working or not. And working on a really complex background can sometimes make the colors not as accurate, or they're not a good portrayal of what colors you're choosing. So for this, I started with a chalk brush. And even if it was Blossom or Bubbles, pretty much I look at something like this and I immediately see the different shapes that the character has. So if we can, I'm going to lower down the opacity on one of these. So on Bubbles, immediately the giant oval should be the standout, and that's her head. So I know that when I'm rendering it, I got to be thinking about how would I render an oval and then apply it to the different textures like skin or the eyeball texture that Bubbles actually has. So then her arms would be very cylindrical, and then they'd be like rounded out nubs. So then it would be rounding out like a cylinder on the arm point, and then at the very tip, I'm going to be rounding it like a sphere. And then same with the other arm. And then for the body, her body would be cylindrical as well, even though on this cartoon version, it looks very flat, but we can imagine that there's a body in there, and then the legs that are sticking out are going to be the exact same thing as the arms. And those are going to be, it's a cylinder, and then at the very tip, it's going to be like a sphere. And then the hair, you can kind of play with the shaping of it. I try to stick really closely to the original drawing. So for Buttercup, I did stick with that the shaping of the hair, but I gave it that realistic feel. So then I'm going to do the same for either Bubbles or Blossom. And pretty much I'm just still looking at the basic shapes. And the reason that a Powerpuff Girl or anything similar to this, so most cartoons from the 90s, it works so well is because if you look at them, it's all basic shapes. And then when you think about rendering it in like a 3D space, you just take those shapes and put it in a 3D form sense. So you're going to be thinking about it a little differently. Okay. So then once I would go from here, then I would actually round out the objects based on where my lighting is. And then I would think about the different textures, like I said. So I think right now I'm going to do the poll so that we can go ahead and get started. Because if we want to keep this within an hour live stream, or maybe a little longer depending on how well the process is going. All right, so I'm going to take my poll on either Blossom or Bubbles. So I'm going to look at your comments here. Let's see. Okay, so we got 1, 2, 3. And try not to vote twice because I'm not looking at the comments so much. Yeah, him is a great supervillain. Actually, most of the villains in Powerpuff Girls is probably the reason I watched it as a kid. Like Mojo Jojo, the Gang Green Gang, Sedusa, all of them. Fuzzy Lumpkins, that's right. Okay, so it looks like Bubbles won by 1 vote. And eventually I'll do Blossom because I feel if I do 2 of them, I might as well do the third one. But for this specific stream, I'm going to go ahead and do Bubbles. So let's see here. So I'm going to pretty much just copy that initial sketch we did. I'm going to try to resize it the same as Buttercup here. All right, I'm going to hide the Buttercup one. There we go. Okay. And I'm going to move our Bubbles reference to the side. And you know what? I'm going to extend the canvas a little wider so I can see this better. All right, so even when I started with the Buttercup drawing, I definitely started with their basic color layouts. So normally for something like this, I won't start in line art because I'm going to be working so much in the rendering process that I try not to focus on, I'm going to move this to the side as well, on the line work. And the line work is so simple. If I did add it, it would just be kind of a waste of time. And I'm trying to be as time efficient as possible. So for this, I'm going to go ahead and start laying it out. So the one thing that I probably would add to the sketch is the eyes, just so that I have a better idea of where to place my colors. Because something like this can look really scary really fast if the initial shapes are looking like off. Because since they have these giant eyes, and they can either look cute, which is what we're going for, or super scary, which is not what we're going for. It could be what you're going for, but for this specific stream, it's not what we're going to be going for. No, I'm not going to give Bubbles bags under eyes, like she's been staying up too late or something. Party hard. Okay, so that's my initial sketch. So you can see it's not even that detailed. It's just something that I can work on top of. And this is something that I do a lot for pieces where I try not to focus on the line work. I try to focus on the rendering and color usage. So I make a new layer on top of this layer. I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to color pick from Buttercup. And if I really, really wanted to do this like time efficient or with like a certain amount of personal, like I don't know, if I was on a time constraint, I guess, pretty much what I would do, I would just copy Buttercup, make a new layer, change it to color. And then you can see it if you lay it out then. You can change like the eye color to blue really, really fast. And then obviously I wouldn't give her that mean look. I would have changed the eyebrows and make the eyes bigger. But things like this can save you just a bunch of time if you're looking for ways to be more efficient with your time usage. But obviously this is something that it wouldn't work as well because people could see like this is just Buttercup with a blue color on top. And this is something that I do want to change. So I try to avoid doing this as much as possible because it's not really good practice in learning rendering or practicing your techniques or lighting. It's kind of taking shortcuts when you are on a time constraint. The chalk brush is a default brush, but I decided to choose one of them, and you can download the chalk brush that I'm using in this tutorial on our Concept Cookie brushes page. And it is one of the basic brushes, so it's a free brush. You can go ahead and grab it. Yeah, I will definitely link you on after this stream's over. And it's true for all the tutorials or live streams that I ever do with Concept Cookie is that you can download all of the brushes or any of the resources that I use or textures, whatever it may be. And even the color palette, I'm still working on building it because I don't want to just push out colors that I'm not sure if they work well together or not. I want to actually test them and make sure that I enjoy them and I think they work well before I just hand them out. So I'm still working on them because skin is probably the number one thing I work with in concept art, and I still haven't found like the really good skin color palette that I've been kind of desperately trying to figure out. Because I know that you can't just rely on one patch of skin for all the characters that you're going to draw, but I really like to have at least a base kind of set for colors to choose from, and that's something that I haven't really been able to find yet. And I'm going to move the arm down so it actually connects to her shirt, because in the drawing, it's kind of connected to the side of her head there. Since this is supposed to be somewhat of a more realistic version, I want to push it out of the shirt there. And then from here, I could either go really fast and just make a one base color layer and then draw on top of that, which is normally what I would do. I don't like to do like separation of colors like this. So for example, let's say for Bubbles, I'm going to grab that blue. And on a layer underneath, or no, that's too saturated. I'm just going to grab that skin color, make it a little darker in both hue and value. And I'm going to use that as like my base color. And the reason it's, well, at least for me, it's easier to draw on a base color because it's less intimidating than just drawing on just a gray slate. And especially if you're working right on top of a white slate, that's even harder. So I would almost always recommend changing the color of your background, especially to something more of a neutral color. So like a neutral gray would be ideal. And like I said earlier, it's just so that you choose colors that are more in line and in harmony with each other. All right, so then from there, I would pretty much work up. I'm going to erase that. From here then, I would just work up the different colors on top of that. So now, Bubbles has blonde hair, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to color pick this blonde color and lay it right on top, because this yellow it's not what we're looking for. If we're going for more of a realistic sense, and I'm trying to render this, not so much so that the proportions or the anatomy is realistic, but the way that the different areas of the actual subject matter is rendered. So for this example, I'm going to go ahead and start doing my blonde. And when I do blonde hair, I try to make it a lot more muted because I don't find like yellow hair to be blonde. When I think of blonde hair, I think it's like a light brown that has some yellow hues in it, but it's not overwhelming like the cartoon version. And it obviously works really well for cartoons or different aspects, but if we're going for like a realistic rendering of blonde hair, I would stick with starting with a light brown base, and then I'm going to show you how to build up the color from there. Her left arm is a little bit weird now that I think about it. I might move that down as well, because you're right, that is also in a really obscure spot. And that's one of those things where, like, for cartoons, it's fine. Like, you can play with different extremes like that. But then when you really think about it, I mean, that arm, it doesn't even make sense. Especially if we're going to do, like, a realistic version like we are here. Now for hair, the one thing that I do recommend is don't make the edges clean, because it's a lot easier to draw like those little individual strands of hair if you leave the edge work kind of almost messy in a way. And we'll get to that more as we go on, but like I said, I like to lay down kind of a base color first and then work up the details from there. So then on the layer underneath of this hair is where I'm going to do her eyeballs. And the reason I'm putting the layer underneath of it so that I can draw right under the hair without worrying about if it's colliding or not. Now for the actual eyeball color, so the white part of the eye, and I say that in quotes because the white part of the eye isn't actually white. The only thing that should be a pure white is that highlight. And you can see on the buttercup drawing, the highlight is the only thing that's a pure white. And then maybe some areas on the reflection on her body are that white, but for the most part, it's just going to be that specular. And for the white part of the eye, I like to choose this color, which is kind of like a desaturated purple gray. And I think it works really well in not really grabbing a lot of attention and like letting it focus on the iris, because if the white part of the eye was like a blinding white, it would almost be distracting, and that's not at all what I'm going for. I had to refer to my original sketch to see where that eyeball is going to be. And then on the other side of the eye, you would barely see this muted purple color, because the irises are just so big that they kind of take up most of the eye socket. And now, the best thing... Oh, yeah, and if you're wondering, I'm going to be posting this on YouTube afterwards. So if you missed the stream or you wanted to rewatch a certain part of it, it will be posted to the YouTube page. All right, so now we're getting to the actual iris part. And just like I said with the hair, I'm not just going to color pick from the cartoon version, because we're going to do a realistic rendering. And when I do stuff like this, I like to work from darks and build up my lights from there. So for bubbles, I'm going to choose this darker, more bold blue. And then wherever the light's hitting, so if the light was coming above, and I think I'm going to use the same light source as the buttercup one so I can place them all in the same scene later. So the sun, or whatever that light source is coming from overhead. And since the iris, the actual iris part of the eyeball is concave, or convex, it's, I'm trying to do like a side view of an eyeball. So it's almost like there's a contact that acts as that invisible, or not invisible, as the wet part of the eye, and it like bubbles over the actual eyeball part. And you can think of it as like a contact, and that's where we get that reflective shine near the top. But the light would be pushing through this clear section of the eyeball, and it would land on the bottom part of the iris. So that's why the bottom of irises usually tend to be lighter in color. And I'm going to show you how to do that once we get to putting a light source in the scene. But for now, like I said, I'm just laying down my base colors. I'm laying out the eyeball for the other side. I have to make sure that I'm keeping them in complement to each other. So I want to make sure it looks like they are both looking in the same direction. And then finally, I don't usually recommend using pure blacks, but for this, I'm going to go ahead and make the pupil part of the eye an almost pure black. Ah, thank you. That's the name of it, the cornea. I was like trying to remember as I was doing it, and I could not for the life of me remember. Yeah, and then the center of the eye is the pupil. So the black part is called the pupil. Then I'm going to flip it so I can see what it looks like from the other side. And this is just one of those digital art tricks that you'll get used to doing, and you almost become accustomed to flipping your image. And it's to see the proportions, the quality of the angling, everything. It really helps to have that on a keyboard shortcut or something to keep it moving. Tim, can you remember what that book was, what the cool bird one on it is called? I've forgotten. Something with color. Yes, so that is the James Gurney Color and Light book, and I'm actually going to be doing a review of that book in either next week or the week after, because I find that it's so important, it was so invaluable for me that I want to put it out there so that maybe people will think about getting it for Christmas or something where it's in the back of their minds and they should really, really think about spending some money on getting that book. And it's not even that expensive. It's like $20, I bet, on Amazon. All right, so I'm going to work on adding this mouth here. And then Bubbles will have that extra challenge of having a tongue as well. So for Buttercup, I could just do a simple smile line, but for Bubbles, I'm going to actually have to add, at least try to make it look like a realistic tongue. All right, and I'm just going to grab that blue for her clothes here. And I'm going to lay them on pretty flat, but I just got to keep in mind that eventually I'm going to have to round it out. Then I did say I'm going to move that arm. I'm true to my word, so I'm going to go ahead. And I can definitely see where they moved it because her head is so large that it's actually hard to place this. Okay, and then lastly, I'm going to grab that same color that I used for the white part of the eye. I'm going to lay it down on top of the leg here. And this will act as her sock, or whatever the white part is on her legs. And I'll just do quick gestures as to those little shoes that they wear. And I'm not sure exactly what kind of shoes these would be, but I imagine they would be shiny, and that's why I gave it kind of that shiny property in the Buttercup one. Because I'm not sure if they're like ballet kind of shoes where they absorb a lot of light, but I thought it would be a good contrast to the clothes, since the clothes I felt like would absorb most of the light, and then these shoes would reflect it. So those are some other things that you can think about while you're doing stuff like this. Is like the eyes are going to be reflective and the skin's going to be somewhere in the middle, mostly absorbing it, and the hair would absorb it, the clothes will mostly absorb it. So if the eyes are the only thing that would be reflecting light, that's definitely going to direct a lot of your attention, and it's going to hold it near the eye section. But the shoes will definitely redirect some of that attention down, and that way you're getting a circular motion from the eyes to the shoes, and in general, the whole character. So it's good to be thinking of the different properties of the materials and having those complement each other as well. Alright, so these are pretty much the base colors that I've chosen, and this is where it gets kind of fun, because obviously with just the base colors, it looks pretty primitive, and it's not very impressive, but now is where we can start to add the detailing, and this is where it'll start looking nice. So my favorite part about drawing characters are the eyes, so I'm going to go ahead and start with that on Bubbles as well. And like I said, I'm going to keep the same light source that I did for Buttercup. So I'm going to imagine that it's this sun or this really bright white light, and it's coming from overhead and slightly to the right. So like we said with that eye example up here, the light's going to be passing through the cornea. It's going to be landing on the bottom part of the iris. So I'm going to add this lighter blue and blend it in on the bottom section of the iris. And I'm going to be pressing very gently on the tablet. And then I'm going to kind of let it fade into the actual top part of the eye. You'll see how you'll start to get that effect that you can actually like sense that there's a light in the being drawn into the actual scene here. So the direction of lighting is very important, and you want to keep it as consistent as you possibly can, because if it's inconsistent, it'll throw off the viewer and ultimately just kind of throw off the piece in general. I'm going to grab that blue. I'm going to color pick something a little more saturated and lighter in value. That'll give us that really intense blue. I'm going to use it even more exclusively on this bottom area here. And you can see how easy that was from it to turn into a flat-looking eyeball to giving it some life. And that's why I really love rendering, because you can do things like this, and if you can just do it on the entire piece, you'll really get a nice rendered looking piece. And it shouldn't be painstaking. I hear a lot of people that don't like to work with color because it's intimidating, or they're not good with color, but I think it's because you just need to practice more, and you need to learn work with color. So don't let color be your enemy. You want it to be your, well, in my case, color is probably my best friend. That's why I usually don't even start my images in black and white. because I really like working and blending with color right from the get-go. And then for the whites of the eyes, I should have explained that one, but I just grabbed an almost pure white, and then kind of did the opposite that I did with the iris, and the light would be hitting on the top, and then it would be fading down as it goes around into the actual eye. And this part's a little harder to see because, like I said, her irises are so big that you can barely even see the white parts of the eye. But they're definitely there. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and move on to the skin. So I'm going to grab this really dark color. I'm going to lay it on the side here. So this is going to be kind of like my color swatches. So right now, this is going to act as my shadow color down here. This is going to act as my neutral. So then we definitely are going to have some in-betweens, and then we're going to have a highlight. And pretty much these four colors are going to be what I'm going to be using to render the entire skin of the character. And if you're wondering, I'm still using the chalk brush, so nothing has changed there. And when I'm doing something like this, I'm just keeping in mind where the light source is coming from, and then adding in my shadows or my highlights or whatever it may be according to where that light source is coming from. And you can see that I chose not the darkest skin color that I have on my palette, but the one next to it, because I like to slowly build in my colors. Because if I went straight for the shadows, then I might get this kind of harsh contrast from the dark skin color to the light one. And I like to have a slow build up so that the colors tend to blend more easier together. And I'm keeping in mind that the hair is going to cast a little shadow. And as we get to the arm. So, like I keep continuing to say, is I'm remembering where that light source is coming from. And the arms are going to be rendered like soft cylinders, if that makes sense. And they're going to be rounded out on the ends. So I'm imagining this character like in a 3D space and how the lighting would fall upon these different shapes and then trying to light it accordingly. So something like this back arm is going to probably be almost completely in shadow, except for maybe like just part of it sticking out will be catching that light. But like for the Buttercup one, you can definitely see there's definitely like a definitive line that the head would be casting a shadow onto the arm, and that's what will give that hyper sense of realism. So don't think that shadows have to be soft everywhere. In some areas, you can actually think of them as being hard shadows, especially if they're closer to the object that's casting the shadow. So now I'm going back in with my darker skin color, and I'm just giving it... I usually like to start by giving it a slight outline and then kind of blend it into the area that I'm outlining. So you can see how I barely have to press on the tablet at all, and it's already giving that really nice effect, and it's rounding it out. And you'll kind of be able to tell then how the objects are popping out. You'll get a sense of the 3D space that the character is in, and then it becomes a lot easier to render. Like from here, the shoes and the clothes are going to be easier to render because I have an established light in the scene, and that's what I'm going to be working off of. And something else that I do a lot, and I think it's a good thing to practice, is color picking. So I believe it on a Mac and a PC, it's just holding Alt. You can see how this color dropper tool picks up, and anywhere you press, it's going to pick up that color, and then you can use it right away. And that's kind of a tip on blending, because when you're blending, you constantly want to be picking up the color and then blending it in. Because if I only chose that dark skin color and I would try to blend it from there, I'd have to be pressing really, really lightly on my tablet to blend that color. But then if I laid it down and then color picked a color from there, then it's not so stark of a contrast when I'm laying it down. And I'm going to do the same for the arms. Like I said, I think I'm going to keep most of that other arm in shadow, because the direction of the light, it would be falling upon the head, and then the head would be casting that shadow on the arm itself. Someone said this is wanting me to paint Mojo Jojo. And the villains would be really fun to do a realistic rendering, because their colors are so unrealistic that it would be really fun to draw them in a realistic sense. It's like the Green Gang, they all have green skin tones, so that would be just kind of an interesting practice and challenge almost to see what it would look like with a realistic rendering. So even though this arm and the head are going to be very similar in that dark skin color, I'm going to be adding a rim light later, and that's what's going to separate the head from the arm. You can see on Buttercup, I have these blue outline, and that's my rim light, and that's what's separating that character from the background. And it works really well in different cases, but I recommend don't overdoing it, because overdoing rim lights then can almost cheapen your image, and it becomes almost unrealistic, because if you add so many rim lights, it almost becomes like a fantastical illustration, which maybe that's what you're going for, but that's something that I try to avoid. And you can see how the eyes, they don't really stand out too much from the skin. So I'm going to give the eyeballs a slight outline of that skin color. The shortcut to flip the canvas, for me, I have mine set up on Command Q, but I believe it's a longer shortcut initially. And to change that, all you would do is you would go to your keyboard shortcuts, and on a Mac, it's under Edit on the top menu, but on a PC, I believe it's under either File or Photoshop. And then from there, you can find keyboard shortcuts and set up, or not keyboard shortcuts, flip image horizontal. And originally it's under image rotation, flip canvas horizontal. But yeah, I definitely recommend setting that up as a keyboard shortcut to help save you some time. All right, so just like we did with the Buttercup one, you can see how there's this stark green line. Let's see if I can grab a good color to point to it. And it happens right under her head. And that's because the head is casting a shadow in that general direction, because that's where the light direction is coming from. and that shadow is going to be falling right on top of that shirt that she's wearing. So the same would be happening with bubbles here. So the closer it is to the object that's casting the shadow, the harsher of a shadow line it's going to be. So that shirt line where this light is coming, or is being drawn on right now, that's going to be very sharp right at the head, and then as it goes farther away, it's going to kind of blend into the shadow, but not too much. Like, we still want that shadow to stand out quite a bit. And then the band on her shirt is that black as well, so I'm going to go ahead and add that. Yeah, so in the reference picture, her head has some arms there. So I'm going to flip that image and then make sure that I get that general light sense. Because rendering is all about lighting and how lighting is bouncing off different materials and textures, how it's either absorbing or reflecting. And something like this is just so crucial to adding that idea of a realistic lighting setup in your scene. All right, so I'm going to flip it back. Then I'm going to go ahead and start to do the same for the stockings here. So the stockings, I'm thinking of these cylinders. So then the light's going to be the strongest, kind of in the center, but slightly off center. And then it's going to blend into the base color that we set up earlier. All right, so now it's starting to look pretty good. So then if I take those layers off, or that layer I should say, you can see the difference that we've already added, and it's really giving that 3D sense of form to the character. So now I'm going to go ahead and add more to the blonde hair. So this is going to be the color I'm going to use. So I'm going to lay out the skin or the hair colors up here. And I'm going to place this kind of sandy blonde color in areas that the light would be reflecting it the strongest. So usually hair is an easy way to draw hair is to draw it from the lighting in the center and then have it kind of pillow out to the edges. All depending on where the light source is coming from. So this one is coming from overhead, like we continue to point out. So I'm going to draw those hair strands being strongest from that initial direction of the lighting and have it fade out to the edges. So you can see how different the color choices are for blonde than in the reference image. And like I said, usually for blonde colored hair, I don't use yellows at all. I'll use very sandy looking colors, browns, light browns. And I think that gives a better look to blonde hair than using yellow hues. unless if the character specifically has like yellow dyed tone hair, then yeah, I definitely recommend using yellow. Or if it's for a cartoon or something like the Powerpuff Girls, yeah, yellow, you can use yellow to represent blonde hair, because you're not going to be trying to do hyper realistic hair for a cartoon. So then for her pigtails we have here, I'm going to keep it pretty loose. Because like I said, it's easier to work on hair later on when it's a little messy. But I still want to give it the form. So I want to kind of show that these are very circular pigtails. So I have to render that to give off the impression of that shaping. So right now for me, it's starting to look like she has this like worried face, because I think I pulled the hair too far down on this side of the head. And this is something that you don't have to feel like you have to commit to fully, because I definitely think a lot of people think that once they start rendering, if they see something that's wrong, they just try to render around it or just try to over render it so that it blends in as much as possible. But I always think that if there's something about the piece I don't like, I'm not just going to let it be and try to work around it. I'm just going to go in and fix it and not have to pretend like I'm not liking it. So that definitely feels a little better to me. Might edit some more after, but I think that'll be a good pull down, because then we can draw more of that specular light on top of the eyeball once we've finished doing some more rendering. So you can see how I'm doing like just quick strokes to give the impression and gesture of the hair. So I'm not worrying about it looking perfect, and that's something else that I try to steer digital artists from doing, especially when they get started for the first time. Don't worry if it doesn't look perfect from the start. You just got to trust your skills and your abilities, that as you work on the piece, it'll just continually get better. Okay, so you can see as I turn that layer on and off, I'm going to merge that layer down too. You can definitely see the difference that we're starting to make, and it's definitely giving more of an impression. So then from here, so this is almost what I would consider the first pass of rendering. And actually I'm going to render out that tongue a little more as well. So the tongue itself would be completely in shadow. I mean, you might get like some light on the very end, but that might just look kind of strange. So I'm going to go ahead and put that all in shadow. Okay, so then this would be kind of like stage one of detailing. So I'm going to go ahead and make a new layer and then get started on stage two. So stage two is when I'll start doing like the finer rendering, and I'll start adding more highlights in as well. So one is almost like you're adding more shadows, or at least for me, and then Stage 2 is where I'll go in and I'll continue to round it out, but rather than do it with my shadows, I'll do it with my highlights and my light values. But I'm not going to try to just add tonal contrast just to add it. Like, I want to add values that make sense and it's believable to the lighting that we have in place already. And then I have some pretty good and easy tricks on how to make the eyes look more believable. And I'll do that in just a second. But I want to make the skin looking a little better first. You should render a pimple on bubbles to add to the realism. When I say rendering, yeah, a lot of people think I'm talking about 3D, but I say that when I do concept art because when I render something, I always think about rendering it as you're rendering a lighting system. So I'm adding these different values and these colors because I'm thinking about how it would render in a scene with the light and how the light would be falling upon the character. So yeah, I mean, when I went to school, I learned a lot of 3D, actually only 3D, because technically my background, I'm a 3D artist, but I really love drawing, and I've been drawing my entire life. So I kind of applied what I learned in the 3D aspects to my 2D skills, and that's where I think I interchanged a lot of the terms and the dialogue, because I just see so many similarities between the two, and that I think they can interchange really easily. Oh yeah, opening up that eye definitely makes it feel better to me. Usually you set your pen pressure for each brush you use? Yes, so I'll usually just always have my transfer turned on, and I'll have it on pen pressure. And I want to say the same for almost every single brush I have. And I think it's just because then I'm familiar with how much I need to be pressing down on the tablet, and the more that you do it, the more you'll become comfortable with knowing what settings work for you and work best for you. So from time to time, I might even turn the opacity on my brush down, but you can see how normally I just keep mine at 100%. And that's not to say that that's the right way to do it, but that's the way that I became comfortable with, and it's a way that, for me, works best. So that's just something you'll get in time with practice. You'll kind of figure out what kind of tools and tips and tricks you use and what ones work for you, because not all of them will. And that's something I think that artists can get frustrated on, where they're trying new techniques or they're doing something and it's just not working for them. And that's not to say that, I mean, they could just be doing it wrong, but there's a good chance that it just might not be what's comfortable for them and it doesn't work with their flow and their work pattern. All right, before I get lost in just kind of mindlessly rendering this, one of the best things you can do for the eye, like I said, I was going to get to the eye, and I'm going to hold my word to that, is adding speculars. Now, the eye is surrounded by skin, and skin will mostly absorb lighting unless if it's wet or if it's sweating, something where it has a reflective, almost coating on it. But for the eye, it's a wet surface. It has that look of it being shiny, and that's what we're trying to replicate. So you can see on Blossom, or on Buttercup, we have this really intense highlight that's not really seen anywhere else, not even on the skin, the hair, and just barely on the shoes, and those are supposed to represent shiny shoes. So on Bubbles, I'm imagining, okay, the light source is coming from that overhead area, so I'm going to add that shine somewhere near the top. And it could, depending on the kind of look that I want the specular to have, I would either just make it a solid circle and maybe just blur out the edge just a little bit, or the way that I've been doing it I'm going to keep it consistent with the way that I did with Buttercup. It's kind of have like that stroking effect where the highlight kind of fades off in like brush strokes. And then I'll also add some of those specular lights around the edges of the eye. And this is where I think it can add a lot of that realism, that it's very subtle and you might miss it when you're looking at something. But these are the details that will really make something look believable and rendered out. So you can see even on Buttercup, I have these 3 little specks here. I have a line here. And then the overwhelming thing that is kind of subtle, but it definitely stands out, is the reflection light that is on the bottom portion of the eye. So if you can imagine the eye, it's a sphere, and if there's like clouds or light under, let's say, bubbles in this scenario, there's going to be light that's going to be bouncing off the earth or whatever it is that she's flying over, and that light's going to be reflected on the bottom part of her eye. So you know what, I'm going to make a new layer for this one. So I'm going to lightly kind of just draw in a soft light from underneath. And then I'll use my eraser tool to draw in different indentations. And this is what will really make the reflection look believable. And if it's something that it may look a little intense right away, it's because I'm working at full opacity. So usually when doing stuff like this, I'll usually work at a higher opacity and then lower it after I feel I did enough work on it. Okay, so I'm going to lower the opacity. And there you can definitely see the difference between 1 and 2, where we add that, I don't know if you want to call it lower reflection, but the lower half of the eye reflection, and it just gives that much more believability that she's flying over an area that's reflecting or bouncing light back up at her eye. Sorry, I should be looking at the questions here. Let's see. Okay, little random question for you while you're drawing. How much would you say you've grown as an artist since you were, say, 16 or so? Were you as good then as you are now? Did you ever feel like most new artists do nowadays back then and didn't like your own work? There we go. Yeah, so that's really interesting because I didn't even open Photoshop until I was 19. So when I was 16, I didn't even know what Photoshop or digital art or tablets were. So yeah, my art was definitely a little different back then than it is now, because now I'm 24 and I couldn't imagine not living with my tablet and digital art. But yes, I am definitely one of those that can look back, and not even when I was 16, but I would say even like a year ago, and I can just look back and just point out areas that I feel I've learned or I've, I don't know, where you can look back at something and be like, man, that's a poor way of rendering that area there. I know how to do it nowadays. The problem is if you look back at something and you don't, you've improved. Oops, I raised that hairline a bit too much. And I always thought I wanted to do a post on Concept Cookie where I would just show you guys what my work was like when I was 16, when I was 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, and then 24, and just show you I want to say growth because I feel like I've grown since then, but just the progress that every year you make, and you can see it, and you can definitely see it on a large scale like that, because sometimes you'll compare your art from like now from like maybe a few months ago, and it'll probably look pretty similar. But if you compare it to things that are more drastic, so years, that's when you'll start to see, oh yeah, like that's when I started to understand color balance, and maybe that's where I started to understand daylight systems and rendering environments, stuff that you didn't know back then. And That's why I always recommend that at least once a year, just redraw something that you drew in the past. And I say that because you'll just recognize how much you've grown, and it's like a direct comparison. So yeah, I hope that answers your question, and I think eventually I will get to doing a post like that, because I think it's important for artists to know that it does take time, and you're not just going to learn digital art like overnight. And I know most professional artists will say that, but I would even say within a year it'll take you longer than just a year to really master, or not even master. I shouldn't say master. I don't think any digital artist feels like they've mastered Photoshop or digital art. They just have grown more than others. All right, I'm getting lost doing rendering in this hair, so I'm going to stop that before I continue to ramble on about nothing, and then get back to rendering the eye. So then usually I'll add in just a few like highlights from where the sun will pretty much pierce the eye and land directly on the pupil. And I'll add in just a few of those highlights in there. So this back eye is interesting because since the head is turned and there's like almost the head is in shadow on this side, I'm not going to be drawing a specular on this side of the eye. That's because I feel like the head would be turned in this imaginary space enough where the specular wouldn't even be able to land on the actual eyeball itself. But that specular would be somewhat on the skin, so I'm going to go ahead and lay that on. But I'm going to do it very soft and very gently. Then I'm also going to draw little highlight marks for where the mouth is open on the bottom, because the light would be catching that bottom lip, and that's what will give the impression that the mouth is open. Oh yes, I think fundamentals is something that even artists that are really well established, and you may look at them and think, oh man, they know exactly what they're doing. Even they will practice fundamentals over and over again, because you can never practice fundamentals enough. And I stress that because I know a lot of people want to do like the really cool renderings and make awesome characters, but if you don't know anatomy or you don't know proportions, your characters probably aren't going to be that cool. I mean, you might have cool ideas or they might have cool personalities, but they might just look completely off if you're not drawing, or you're not learning the basics of what makes a character up first. And before I ramble on too long, so for the hair here, you can see how I grabbed a darker brown, and this is to separate the hair from each other because it was blending into each other a bit too much. And now I can start to add in some of that shadow on the hair as well. Yeah, try not to trap yourself in that mindset that you're really good at drawing people, or maybe like portraits, like you said in the comments. Don't just stick to that, because if you just draw portraits, I mean, obviously you'll get stronger in some aspects, but your range of what you could learn would be so much more limited than if you did like a creature or something that would be out of your comfort zone. And that's why I even do these Monday live streams with my friends, because sometimes the topic is something that I'm not very comfortable with. Like next week we're going to do vehicles, and I don't think I've ever drawn a vehicle in my life. So to do a vehicle just kind of on the spot, it'll be kind of a good test to see, okay, what do I learn about vehicles? Where does my mind go? Like what references do I grab initially to draw vehicles? And then I can learn from that by kind of seeing, okay, what did I lay down? What can I do better next time? And it's always a learning experience. But if you do portraits all the time, then you already know what you're good at, and you're just kind of rehashing that skill set. You're not really learning anything. Now for these pigtails, I'm really trying to emphasize that there's a roundness to it. So I'm really placing that shadow underneath of this pigtail that's in the foreground here and on the other side of the hair. And every now and then I'll draw like a few individual strands. Okay, so now this is probably at level 2 of rendering. I'm going to merge these layers down. Another trap that I definitely find myself in a lot is going to a multiply or an overlay layer too soon in the drawing. Because you really want to lay down the colors based on your perception of them rather than having to rely on overlay or multiply or whatever crutch it is that you may use, and I know those are mine, to give you your colors to really emphasize values or contrast or whatever it may be. So I try to save that till the very end, and I recommend that you try it as well, because then you'll just become better and more well suited on picking colors on your own rather than having to rely on a layer filter. All right, so this is probably level 2 of rendering. So I'm going to go through each. So then this was our base colors, rendering 1 and rendering 2. And you can see how even just with rendering 2 stage on the head, we're already getting so much more detail than we had before. So I'm going to pull that same rendering that we were doing before, I'm going to pull it into the arms and the clothing here right now. So the arm itself, I'm just going to give a little more impression of an outline because the skin value and the background value are so close to each other that it almost gets lost a bit. So I'm going to go ahead and separate it just a little. And I'm sorry if I say that word too much. I realize that even in tutorials I say a little all the time. I feel like it's my go-to for saying how I do things. Like, oh, I'm going to blend this a little. We're going to take that color and push it in right there a little more. So, yeah, if I catch myself doing that, I'll try to stop it because I know sometimes it's a little annoying when I'm listening to a tutorial or a speech and someone's like repeating the same words over and over. So now, just like I did those lighter colors on the top part of the skin here, on her forehead, I'm going to bring that down into her arm as well. Yeah, and if you didn't notice before, now you will notice because I put attention on it. And then for the stockings, I'm going to grab that really muted purple gray and choose kind of a lighter version of that. And then lay on some more where the lighting would be hitting it the strongest and then blending it out. And that's going to round it out that much more. And then I'm just going to give it a few highlights. Yeah, I'm going to do it just a little more. And something else is you could probably see the backside of this dress. So since her leg is being pulled up, And actually I could probably draw... no, I'm not going to draw the other part of the leg, but I'm going to draw the back of the dress. So if you have no idea what I'm talking about right now, is that back of the dress would be pulled up because her leg is bent upward. So we would be able to see the inside of that dress area just a little bit. A little bit. See, I'm catching myself now. I got to stop doing that. And pretty much that is just going to add a little more sense of realism because then the dress becomes a 3D form, and I'm thinking about it as if the legs were inside of the dress. So the dress itself, even though it's absorbing most of that light, I'm still going to add some of that hue contrast to give it that sense of it being more of a form rather than a flat shape. And for the shoes, like we said earlier, I'm going to give it that shiny appearance. So I'm going to grab that almost pure white from the eye. Imagining where that light source is coming from. And also, since we have that light source bouncing on the bottom of the eye, we're imagining, well, it would also be bouncing on the bottom side of the shoe. So things that are more reflective, you can definitely think about adding more highlights. Well, I mean, don't just add them to add them. Make sure that there's some kind of logic and reasoning behind it. But when I do it, I like to add my white and then kind of build it up. Okay, so then if I turn that layer on and off, you can see the difference that level 2 gives our character. And now for the last stage that I'm going to do for the stream is I'm going to do level 3. And level 3 rendering would be doing things like rim lights or extreme highlights or things that really make the character stand out. So in this case, I'm probably going to have bubbles underneath of Blossom, and that's why I gave her this blue rim light initially. But just for the sake of this time lapse, I'm going to do the same for bubbles. So a rim light is used to separate the character from the background, and it's definitely something that is overused, especially in the industry. You'll start to see them everywhere, but they really do make a difference in rounding out the character and adding that just extra touch of realism. So you can see as I add this very light blue, and usually, by the way, light blue is usually the color, like the go-to color for rim lights. And it's because it just adds a nice temperature as well to this third lighting system that we're adding, which is our rim light. And lighting system, if you don't know what that is, there's a whole fundamental tutorial on Concept Cookie that you could watch. And it's all about how usually characters are lit in a 3-point lighting system. And that's where there's a rim light, fill light, and a main light. So a fill light, if you do modeling, is kind of like an ambient light where it kind of touches upon all aspects of the character. And then your main light, which in this case would be the sun or whatever that really bright white light is, would be the thing that directly lights your character, and it's your main light source, hence the name. And then the rim light is the last light, and that's what will separate the character from the background. Okay, and then the other rendering things that I would do from here is I would make the hair more realistic. So I'd make my brush really, really small, and then I would go in and add in all these little individual strands, and these are the kind of little detail, these are all the details that add that much more of a sense of realism. And usually what I like to do is I'll usually merge all the layers together, and I'll almost blur the hair on the edge. And then that's where then I'll go in and I'll add really crisp looking hair ends, and that's what will give that really nice effect. But this live stream has gone about an hour and 20 minutes. And from here, pretty much I would just be doing more rendering and making it look that much more realistic by maybe even zooming in. And you'll notice how up until this point, I haven't zoomed in once, I believe. And that's because it's important to really look at the character as a whole. And when you zoom in, you get almost like you sign up for zooming in and staying zoomed in for much longer than you might have originally intended. And the worst part is sometimes when you zoom back out, all the detailing that you might have done may not even be that noticeable. So usually I like to do stay zoomed out as long as I possibly can before I feel I can't render accurately anymore. And that's because then from far away, you'll be able to do that much more impact than you would when you're zoomed in. And obviously when you're zoomed in, you can definitely get a smaller brush. You can zoom in and get those different crevices and cracks and make it look really polished and nice. But just remember that your viewer is going to be looking at the picture the same distance that you are. So the viewer won't be able to zoom in to the extent that you will and do all the little nice details and rendering that you might notice, but no one else might notice it. And it's kind of a hard truth to swallow, but you just have to remember that people are just going to look at your image as you present it, so zoomed out, and that's the best quality that you want to show. You want to show the detailing from when it's zoomed out. But that's not to say I don't recommend zooming in and detailing, because you can definitely get really fine details from zooming in, and they definitely will have an impact. Or they may have an impact. I shouldn't say should. They may have an impact on the overall picture. So, yeah, I'm going to cut this stream off, I think, very shortly. But I hope this gives you guys kind of a good sense as to rendering and thinking about having a light in the scene and not always worrying about if it's looking perfect from the start. So if I turn all my layers off, I'm going to put them in different groups so you guys can see this a little easier. A little easier. Man, I am terrible right now. So, okay, so this was the initial sketch. These are our base colors. Our first level of, detailing pass. Our second level. And then our third level. And the third level I'd probably do, I would zoom in and make it look really clean and polished, because from there, you really want to make it look as nice as you possibly can, because at this point, you're not going to be doing major, subject matter changes. At this point, you're just doing the final rendering. And then this is where I may add a multiply and overlay layer, but like I said, try to save it for the very end. And all right. So I'm going to cut it off here because it's gone about an hour, 20 minutes, and I usually try to keep these to an hour nowadays. And I want to thank you all for coming. We do these every Wednesday at 2 p.m., and that's -6 GMT. And the subject matter is usually posted sometime earlier in the day, whether it's on our DeviantArt page or our Facebook page. And sometimes I like to hear what you guys want to see. So maybe during the day or even during the streams, you can just mention what you would like to see in the next stream, and I'll try to cover it. Because that's something I learned by doing the tutorial request on DeviantArt, that I would have had no idea that you guys wanted to see things like fabric folding and clothing wrinkles, and it was kind of a really fun tutorial for me to explore. So, yeah, thank you all for coming to this live stream, and I will post the final bubbles probably within the next few hours on our Facebook page, and I want to thank you guys one more time, and I'm going to cut it off. So, peace out, guys.